The piece of paper hit my dining table so hard it rattled my coffee mug, spilling dark liquid over the rim. Written on it in thick black marker was a single number: $150,000. I looked up slowly from my morning newspaper. Standing over me was Tiffany, my daughter-in-law. Her face was flushed, her arms crossed tight over her chest, and she wore that familiar sneer that told me she was done pretending. "You are living here for free, Richard," she snapped, her voice echoing in the small kitchen of my in-law suite. "You eat our food, you use our electricity, and you take up space. So here is the deal. You hand over your retirement savings to help us out, or you pack your bags and leave this house with your head down." I shifted my gaze to the doorway. Standing right there, staring intently at the hardwood floor, was Brad. My son. The boy I had raised. The boy I had sacrificed everything for. He did not say a single word. He did not even look at me. He just stood there, letting his wife shake down his 70-year-old father like a street thug collecting a debt. The silence in the room was suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rapid, impatient tapping of Tiffany waiting for me to break. She was waiting for me to cry, or beg, or pull out my checkbook right then and there and surrender my dignity. If you are watching this right now, I want you to pause for a second. Subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Have you ever had someone you love look you in the eye and try to strip you of everything you worked for? Did you cry? Did you yell? Well, let me tell you what I did. I looked at that piece of paper. Then I looked at Tiffany. And I smiled. I did not shed a tear. I did not raise my voice. I did not give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. And what I did next, the plan I set into motion that very night, cost her absolutely everything. Sit tight, because this story is going to leave your jaw on the floor. "Are you done?" I asked her, my voice as calm as a summer lake. Tiffany blinked, clearly thrown off by my absolute lack of panic. She opened her mouth to speak again, but I simply picked up my coffee mug, wiped the spilled drops from the table, and took a slow sip. "We will talk about this later," I said, dismissing her completely. Her face turned bright red with rage. She spun on her heel and stormed out, her heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. Brad lingered for a fraction of a second, finally glancing up at me. His eyes were full of guilt. But guilt does not pay the bills, and it certainly does not excuse betrayal. He quickly followed his wife, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. I sat there in the sudden, heavy quiet of my small living room. I set the mug down and picked up the piece of paper. $150,000. That was all she thought my life was worth. What Tiffany did not know, or maybe what she chose to conveniently forget, was the reality of the very ground she was standing on. She called this her house. She loved parading around this upscale neighborhood in Charlotte, bragging to her superficial friends about her sprawling $1.2 million property. But let me drop a little context for you. I am a retired general contractor. For 40 years, I woke up long before the sun, breathing in sawdust and pouring concrete to build a highly successful business from the ground up. I broke my back so my family would never have to struggle. When my beautiful wife Martha passed away 5 years ago, the large empty house we had shared became entirely too much for me to bear. Every room echoed with her absence. So when Brad came to me begging for financial help to buy his dream home for his growing family, I made a decision. I sold my business. I sold my home. I took $500,000 in cold, hard cash, the absolute bulk of my life savings, and handed it over to secure this beautiful estate. The deal we made was simple. They would get the massive main house, and I would get the attached in-law suite to live out my final years in peace, staying close to my newly born grandson. I thought I was buying family unity. I thought I was buying a peaceful retirement, surrounded by the people I loved most. Instead, I had purchased a very expensive, very lonely cage. As a veteran contractor, I spent decades inspecting foundations. I know exactly how to spot hidden rot behind a freshly painted wall. And sitting there at my small dining table staring at Tiffany and her extortion note, I realized the foundation of my own family was entirely rotten. They thought I was just a clueless, dependent old man living on their generous charity. They assumed I would just roll over and hand them the last shred of my financial security because I had nowhere else to go. But you do not survive 40 years in the brutal construction business by being soft. You survive by reading the fine print, knowing exactly where the load-bearing walls are, and understanding leverage. Tiffany wanted to tear down my walls, but she had no idea that I was the one holding the sledgehammer. I folded the piece of paper neatly and slipped it into my shirt pocket. I knew right then and there that I was not going to give them a single dime. But I also knew I could not just react with blind anger. I had to observe. I had to gather my tools. The storm was coming, and I was going to be the one controlling the lightning. Later that night, I retreated to my only real sanctuary on the property, the detached garage. It was quiet out there, away from the tension of the main house. It was the only place that still smelled like my old life, filled with the scent of motor oil, aged wood, and the lingering dust of honest labor. I was sitting at my workbench, running a rag over an old set of wrenches, when the side door creaked open. It was Brad. He hovered in the doorway for a moment, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like a teenager who had just backed the family car into a mailbox. I did not look up immediately. I just kept polishing the wrench, letting the rhythmic metal sound fill the awkward silence. Finally, he stepped inside, rubbing the back of his neck. "Dad," he started, his voice entirely too soft, entirely too cautious. "About what happened inside earlier today." I set the wrench down and looked at him. I waited. He walked over and leaned against a wooden beam, refusing to meet my eyes directly. "Tiffany did not mean to come off so aggressively," he said, forcing a weak, apologetic chuckle that sounded absolutely hollow in the large space. "She is just under a lot of pressure right now. You have to understand she is still suffering from severe postpartum depression. The baby has been keeping her up, and her nerves are completely frayed." I kept my face perfectly neutral. Postpartum depression. My beautiful, healthy grandson was already well over a year old, but I let him continue painting his masterpiece of excuses. "The economy is a mess." Dad, Brad went on, gaining a bit more confidence now that I was not yelling. "Inflation is killing us. You know how much groceries are these days. The property taxes on this place just went up again. We are just dealing with a temporary cash flow problem, that is all. We just need to restructure our debt to get ahead of the interest rates. The $150,000 would just be a bridge loan to help us consolidate. We are a family. We should help each other out." He paused, finally looking at me, searching my face for that familiar parental weakness he had exploited his entire life. And then came the final twist of the knife, delivered with a casual shrug. "Besides," he added, "you do live here rent-free anyway. It is not like you have a mortgage to worry about anymore." The words hung in the cold air of the garage. Rent-free. He actually said it. He stood in a house I bought for him on land I secured for him, with money I bled for, and called me a freeloader. My chest tightened, a sharp pain of absolute betrayal shooting straight through my heart. I looked at this grown man, my own flesh and blood, and saw nothing but a stranger wearing my son's face. He was echoing his wife's poison, wrapping it up in financial buzzwords to make it sound responsible. Restructuring debt, consolidating, temporary cash flow problem. I nodded slowly, offering nothing but a low hum of acknowledgement. Brad took that as a victory. He patted the wooden beam, smiled a relieved, cowardly smile, and turned to leave. "Just think about it, Dad," he called out over his shoulder as he walked out into the cool night air. "We really need you." When the heavy wooden door clicked shut, the silence returned, but the peace was completely gone. I sat there in the dim light of the garage, feeling the crushing weight of a father's unconditional love battling against cold, hard logic. Part of me, the soft, aging part that just wanted to spend my final years rocking my grandson on the back porch, whispered that I should just write the check. I had the money. I could surrender the $150,000, buy their fake smiles for a few more months, and keep the fragile peace. Maybe Brad really was just drowning. Maybe they were desperate, and this was just a poorly executed cry for help. I stood up, feeling every single one of my 70 years settling into my bones, and walked over to the small, grimy window facing the main driveway. I wiped a thick layer of dust from the cold glass to look out at the dark house. And that was when I saw it. Bathed in the pale glow of the street lamp, parked arrogantly across the freshly paved driveway, was a brand new, pristine 2024 Range Rover. The dealer plates were still bolted to the bumper. The chrome trim gleamed like a mocking grin in the dark. The internal debate I was having vanished in an instant, replaced by a profound, icy clarity. I spent 40 long years as a general contractor. Over those 4 decades, I learned one absolute, undeniable truth about structural integrity. You can always tell when a foundation is crumbling. Sometimes the homeowner tries to hide it with a fresh coat of expensive paint or shiny new fixtures, but the cracks always show if you know exactly where to look. A leased luxury vehicle that costs a fortune every single month does not equal restructuring debt. It does not equal struggling with inflation or the rising cost of groceries. It equals dangerous, reckless vanity. The entire story Brad had just spun in my garage was a calculated, pathetic lie. They were not trying to consolidate their debt. They were trying to fund a lavish, unsustainable lifestyle, using my retirement savings as their personal checking account. The thin facade had completely crumbled, exposing the ugly, greedy truth hiding beneath. As I stared at that ridiculously expensive car, I made a silent promise to my late wife. I would not let them selfishly drain the beautiful life we built together. The lie was exposed, and the war had officially begun. The next morning arrived with a damp layer of fog settling over the neighborhood. I woke up much earlier than usual, the bitter taste of last night's conversation still lingering stubbornly in the back of my throat. I brewed a strong pot of black coffee and sat by the window watching the streetlights slowly turn off. Brad had already left for work in his commuter sedan, while that ridiculous new SUV sat untouched and gleaming in the driveway. I finished my coffee, washed the heavy ceramic mug, and walked out the back door toward the side gate where the communal trash bins were kept. It was garbage pickup day tomorrow, and the large municipal bins were already overflowing. I was not usually a man who snooped through other people's belongings. Martha and I always respected boundaries, strongly believing that snooping was the desperate refuge of people who lacked the basic courage to ask honest questions. But honesty had completely left this property the moment they tried to extort my life savings. I lifted the lid of the blue recycling bin. Right on top, sitting innocently among empty wine bottles and fancy sparkling water cartons, was a clear plastic grocery bag stuffed entirely with shredded paper. I stared at it for a long, silent moment. Normal people do not shred local supermarket flyers or basic utility bills. People only shred things they desperately want to keep buried. I reached in, grabbed the clear bag, and brought it straight back into my detached garage. I locked the heavy side door behind me and switched on the bright overhead fluorescent lights. I cleared my large wooden workbench, sweeping aside sawdust and scattered nails, and dumped the contents of the bag right in the center. Hundreds of thin, jagged strips of thick paper cascaded across the worn wood. To anyone else, it would have looked like an impossible, deeply frustrating puzzle. But I was a man who had spent his entire adult life taking chaotic piles of lumber, steel, and concrete and turning them into massive standing structures. I possessed the absolute patience of a saint when it came to putting broken things together. I pulled up my old metal stool, grabbed a fresh roll of clear packing tape from my red toolbox, and got straight to work. The first hour was incredibly tedious. I slowly sorted the scattered strips by color patterns and bank logo fragments. By the middle of the second hour, the dark picture finally began to form. They were monthly credit card statements. Plural. 3 different premium tier credit cards, all registered exclusively under Tiffany's name, none of which had been mentioned in Brad's pathetic garage sob story about inflation and rising grocery costs. I taped the first complete page together and ran my calloused index finger down the long list of recent transactions. A boutique resort stay in Miami for $4,000. A luxury handbag purchase from a high-end designer outlet in Atlanta for $6,000. Routine weekly charges at an exclusive day spa that cost more than what most hard-working families spend on actual food in a single month. The numbers were absolutely staggering. I moved quickly to the next reconstructed statement, my blood running significantly colder with every single strip of paper I meticulously locked into place. The balances carried over from month to month were enormous. She was completely drowning in high-interest debt, paying only the bare minimums, and aggressively letting the principal balloon into a terrifying mountain of absolute financial ruin. There was absolutely no debt restructuring happening here. There was no noble struggle against a harsh, unforgiving economy. Tiffany was eagerly living the extravagant life of a wealthy reality television star on the modest income of a mid-level office manager, and my son was far too weak to step in and stop her. The $150,000 they brutally demanded from me was not a bridge loan to save their family home. It was a desperate lifeline to feed her reckless vanity. I carefully folded the taped statements and slipped them deep inside my heavy canvas tool bag, hiding them securely beneath a pile of heavy iron wrenches. I needed to act completely normal. I needed to flawlessly maintain the illusion that I was still the confused, helpless, dependent old man they arrogantly thought I was. I grabbed a small, genuine bag of regular household trash from my workbench area, unlocked the garage door, and walked casually back toward the side yard bins to dispose of it. As I lifted the heavy plastic lid to toss my small garbage bag inside, the wooden side gate suddenly swung open. Tiffany stood there in a plush designer bathrobe holding an empty designer coffee cup. Her eyes immediately darted from my face down to the recycling bin, checking the top layer of trash. She noticed the clear bag of shredded paper was missing. Her jaw tightened instantly, her posture stiffening like a cornered animal. "What exactly are you doing out here, Richard?" she asked, her voice dripping with venomous suspicion. I let my shoulders slump forward, adopting the frail posture of a weary old man. "Just taking out the trash," I replied softly, offering a confused, harmless smile. "I noticed some raccoons getting into the bins last night, so I wanted to make sure the lids were secured tight." She glared at me clearly, not entirely convinced, but willing to accept my apparent weakness. "Let me make something crystal clear to you." She stepped closer, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You are nothing but a guest on my property. Guests do not snoop around. Guests mind their own business and show proper gratitude for the roof over their heads. Remember your place, old man." I simply nodded slowly, keeping my eyes cast downward in mock defeat. "I understand perfectly, Tiffany," I whispered. She scoffed loudly, turned around rapidly, and marched straight back into the house. I smiled. That slight, knowing smile was the absolute last genuine moment of peaceful amusement I would have for quite some time. By that very afternoon, the silent retaliation officially began. Tiffany had clearly decided that if I was not going to willingly hand over my savings, she was going to make my daily existence as uncomfortable as legally possible. It started with the subtle, invisible things. I sat down in my favorite armchair after lunch, planning to check my emails and read the local news on my tablet, just like I did every single day. But the screen simply displayed a connection error. The entire internet connection was completely gone. I spent 20 minutes restarting my device, checking the router cords, and diagnosing the connection before I finally realized the truth. I walked over to the main house and found Tiffany sitting on the plush living room sofa, mindlessly scrolling through her designer phone. When I calmly mentioned that the internet in the in-law suite was down, she did not even bother respectfully looking up at me. She just casually flipped her hair and stated that she had updated the network security passwords that morning. When I politely asked for the brand new password, she let out a very long, exaggerated sigh. She claimed it was a complex, secure network, now meant only for their primary devices, and that a man of my advanced age really had no need for high-speed internet anyway. She rudely suggested I should just go and read a physical book from the local public library instead. It was a petty, childish move designed entirely to isolate me from the outside world and remind me of my absolute dependence on her goodwill. But the sheer lack of internet access was absolutely nothing compared to the truly heartbreaking cruelty she unleashed later that evening. Brad had come home from work and they were in the kitchen preparing dinner. My grandson was sitting in his high chair, giggling brightly and throwing small, soft blocks onto the floor. I walked in, my heart softening instantly at the wonderful sight of the little boy. He was the only pure, untainted thing left in this entire house. I knelt down carefully, picked up a blue wooden block and held out my arms to lift him out of the chair. Before my fingers could even brush his small shoulders, Tiffany swooped in like a massive hawk. She physically pushed between us, snatching the terrified boy out of the seat and holding him tightly against her chest. She glared at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. "Do not pick him up, Richard," she ordered, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I froze in place, my arms still extended in the empty air. I quietly asked her what the problem was, keeping my tone as absolutely neutral as possible. She looked at my hands, then looked right into my eyes with complete malice. "Your hands are far too shaky lately," she said, speaking loudly, so Brad would clearly hear from the kitchen island. "You are getting weak and clumsy. I am not going to risk you dropping my child just because you stubbornly refuse to admit your old age." I looked slowly down at my hands. The heavy hands that had framed houses, poured concrete, and held my own son with absolute unwavering strength. They were perfectly steady. There was not a single tremor. Brad kept his back turned furiously, chopping vegetables, pretending he was completely deaf to the sheer cruelty unfolding merely 3 feet away from him. It was a cold, calculated campaign of intense psychological abuse. I retreated to my suite without another word, the sharp sting of her insult burning deep in my chest. I realized right then that she was actively trying to break my spirit. But my silent retreat did not mean surrender. Later that night, the house finally grew quiet. I walked softly down the dim hallway toward the shared laundry room to grab a fresh towel. As I carefully approached the slightly ajar door, I heard Tiffany speaking in a hushed, frantic whisper. She was standing alone in the dark laundry room, her cell phone pressed tightly to her ear. I stopped dead in my tracks, pressing my back firmly against the cool hallway wall, making absolutely no sound. Her words drifted through the narrow crack in the door, chilling me to the absolute bone. "No, I told you we have to move fast right now," she whispered, her tone sounding urgent and incredibly greedy. "Brad is totally on board with the plan now. We just need the final medical paperwork signed. Do not worry about the old man. He is losing his mind anyway. The bank will not know the difference if we handle the money transfers online." My stomach dropped instantly into a bottomless pit of pure dread. The bank will not know the difference. The horrible words echoed in my tired mind like a blaring siren. Suddenly, the scattered puzzle pieces slammed firmly together with terrifying, undeniable clarity. The $150,000 extortion attempt was nothing but a distraction. It was merely a test to see exactly how easily I would fold under pressure. They were not just trying to ruthlessly pressure me into paying off her secret luxury credit card debts. They were actively orchestrating a massive systematic takeover of my financial life. They were actually trying to declare me mentally incompetent to seize full permanent control of my entire $800,000 retirement account. They viciously wanted every single penny I possessed, and they were perfectly willing to completely erase my legal autonomy to get it. My gut feeling screamed loudly, that I was in immediate catastrophic danger. I was clearly no longer just an unwanted guest in my own home. I was a marked target. And the absolute worst part was that the greedy people maliciously hunting me down slept just down the hall. The very next morning, I woke up before the sun even considered rising over the horizon. I knew I had to get out of that suffocating, hostile house to verify exactly how deep this vicious betrayal truly ran. I dressed in my oldest pair of faded denim jeans, a comfortable plaid flannel shirt, and my heaviest scuffed leather work boots. I walked out to the detached garage and slowly loaded my heavy green tackle box and 2 fishing rods into the back of my trusty old pickup truck. I made sure to make just enough noise pulling the metal garage door down so that they would hear my departure. As I climbed into the driver's seat, the front door of the main house opened. Brad stepped out onto the porch, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Going fishing today, Dad?" he asked, rubbing his tired eyes and forcing a weak, completely unconvincing smile. I looked at the son I had loved and protected for 35 years, knowing what I had heard his wife whispering the night before. "Yes, Brad," I replied smoothly, keeping my voice incredibly steady. "The weather is perfect for the lake. I just need a long, quiet day on the water to clear my mind." He nodded, took a slow sip of his black coffee and turned back inside, completely satisfied with his own false sense of undeserved security. I backed the truck out of the driveway and drove slowly through the affluent neighborhood, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. But I did not head north toward the quiet waters of Lake Norman. The moment I merged onto the main highway, I took the exit heading straight into the bustling heart of downtown Charlotte. I pulled into the secure parking garage of the large central bank branch where I had proudly maintained my accounts for over 30 years. This was the exact institution where Martha and I had excitedly opened our very first joint savings account. It was the place that held the entire culmination of my life's brutal, back-breaking labor. I walked purposefully through the heavy glass doors, bypassing the regular teller lines entirely, and headed straight for the private offices in the back. I asked the young receptionist to speak immediately with Marcus Thorne, the senior branch manager. Marcus was a sharp, loyal man whom I had known since he was just a junior loan officer. He respected my business, and more importantly, he respected me. Within 2 minutes, Marcus stepped out of his glass office, his face immediately dropping into an expression of profound relief mixed with deep concern the second he saw me standing there in the lobby. "Richard." He breathed out heavily quickly, ushering me inside and closing the heavy door securely behind us. "I am incredibly glad you came in today." I sat down in the leather chair across from his large mahogany desk, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "What is going on, Marcus?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly level. Marcus let out a long and heavy sigh, opened his secure desk drawer, and pulled out a thick manila folder. He pushed it slowly across the polished wood toward me. "2 days ago, Brad came into this office," Marcus explained, his voice dropping to a serious, confidential whisper. "He sat exactly where you are sitting right now. He presented me with a comprehensive power of attorney document, claiming that your mental health had severely deteriorated over the past few weeks. He told me a very tragic, elaborate story about how you were suffering from advanced dementia, that you were becoming a physical danger to his young son, and that he urgently needed to move you into a specialized full-time care facility." I stared blankly at the closed folder, the sterile air of the office suddenly feeling far too thin to breathe. "He requested immediate full administrative access to your primary retirement accounts." Marcus continued watching my face closely for a reaction. "He wanted to initiate a wire transfer of your entire $800,000 balance into a new separate trust account that he solely controlled, claiming it was strictly to pay for your necessary medical care. He even brought a signed physician's note." I reached out with a steady hand and opened the manila folder, slowly feeling the rough texture of the paper beneath my fingertips. Staring back at me was a complex legal document, granting my son absolute financial authority over my entire existence. At the bottom of the final page was my signature. Except It was not my signature. It was an incredibly clumsy, desperate forgery. The loops were entirely wrong, and the pressure of the pen strokes lacked the heavy, deliberate weight I always used. "Why did you not process it?" I asked quietly, not taking my eyes off the forged ink. "Because I have known you for 20 years, Richard," Marcus replied firmly. "I know how you sign your name on a construction contract. And more importantly, I know you would never hand over complete financial control without speaking to me directly." I told Brad the signature required further legal verification and immediately placed a hard freeze on all your assets to protect your money. I closed the folder. The ultimate betrayal was now absolute. Brad had not just stood by passively while his wife bullied me in my own home. He had actively driven to this bank, looked a man I trusted right in the eye, and tried to steal everything I owned while simultaneously erasing my basic human freedom. The crushing sorrow of losing my only son evaporated in that quiet office, instantly burning away into a cold, calculated, terrifying fury that settled deep within my bones. I looked up at Marcus, my mind already forming the first steps of a flawless counterattack. "Keep the freeze active," I instructed softly, "and I need copies of everything in that folder." I left the bank with the thick manila envelope tucked securely under my arm, the weight of my son's ultimate betrayal sitting heavy in my hands. The drive back to the house was a blur of familiar streets and blinding anger, but by the time I turned onto our manicured block, I had locked every trace of fury deep inside a mental vault. I pulled my old pickup truck into the driveway, parking it right next to that gleaming least symbol of their vanity. I walked through the front door, with my heavy green tackle box plastering a tired, unassuming smile across my face. Tiffany was sitting at the expensive marble kitchen island, aggressively typing on her designer laptop. She barely glanced up as my boots scuffed the hardwood floor. Brad was standing by the refrigerator holding a bottle of water. He looked tense, his shoulders hunched as if waiting for a blow to fall. "Catch anything good today, Dad?" he asked, his voice entirely too bright, entirely too fake. I set the tackle box down on the floor with a heavy thud and let out a long, exhausted sigh. "Not a single bite," I replied, shaking my head like a defeated old man. "The fish are just not biting around here lately." But it got me thinking. I walked over to the kitchen sink to wash my hands, letting the warm water run over my calloused skin. I think I need a real change of scenery. I have been feeling a bit suffocated lately, just cooped up in this house. My old buddy Hank has a cabin down in the Florida Keys. He has been begging me to come down for a week of deep-sea fishing. I think I am going to take him up on the offer. I will be leaving tomorrow morning. The kitchen went dead silent for a brief second. I could practically feel the greedy gears turning in Tiffany's mind. A whole week with the old man out of the state. A whole week to finalize their vicious, illegal paperwork without me breathing down their necks. "Oh, Richard, that sounds like a wonderful idea for you," Tiffany chimed in suddenly, adopting the sweet, caring tone of a devoted daughter-in-law. "You have been looking so tired lately. The warm Florida sun will do wonders for your health. You should absolutely take all the time you need." Brad nodded eagerly, his relief so palpable it was actually sickening. "Yeah, Dad, you should go. Do not worry about a thing around here. We will take care of the house and the baby. Just focus on relaxing." I dried my hands on a kitchen towel, hiding the cold disgust that threatened to spill out of my eyes. "Thank you both," I said softly. "I really appreciate your understanding. I will go pack my bags now." I shuffled down the hallway to my in-law suite, my posture stooped, my steps deliberately slow. I was giving them exactly what they wanted, the illusion of an easy, trusting victim. But they had absolutely no idea that my sudden vacation was the very foundation of their absolute ruin. The next morning, I packed a medium-sized duffel bag and loaded it into the truck. Brad and Tiffany stood on the front porch waving goodbye with entirely too much enthusiasm. I drove away, but I did not head south toward the Florida state line. I drove straight to a nearby electronics supply store and spent a very specific hour picking out high-end microscopic security cameras and a hidden cellular router. By noon, I was parked 3 blocks away from my own house, watching through binoculars as Brad and Tiffany loaded the baby into the Range Rover and drove off for their weekly grocery shopping trip. The moment their vehicle turned the corner, I walked swiftly back to the property. I let myself in through the side garage door, moving with the rapid, practiced efficiency of a master contractor. I did not have much time, but I had 4 decades of experience wiring entire commercial buildings. A few hidden cameras were child's play. I started in the main living room. I removed the cover of the central air conditioning vent, spliced the tiny camera into the existing low-voltage power wires, and tucked the lens perfectly behind the metal grates. It provided a sweeping, flawless view of the entire room, including the front door. Next, I moved to the kitchen. I slid a second micro camera behind the heavy crown molding above the cabinets, angling it directly at the marble island, where Tiffany always sat with her laptop and phone. Finally, I entered my own in-law suite. I installed the third and final camera right inside the casing of the smoke detector, pointing directly at my personal filing cabinet and desk. If they came looking for more financial documents while I was supposedly fishing in Florida, I would capture every single desperate move they made. The silence in the house was profound, as I worked, broken only by the soft click of my wire strippers and the steady rhythm of my breathing. Every single screw I turned, every single wire I carefully spliced together, felt like laying the meticulous groundwork for a final decisive battle. I was not just protecting my life savings anymore. I was actively reclaiming my damaged dignity from the cold hands of the people who should have loved me the absolute most. They had forced my hand, leaving me with no other choice. I wired the cameras to a hidden standalone cellular router that I tucked safely inside the attic crawlspace, ensuring Tiffany's petty network passwords could never disconnect me. I tested the live feed on my phone. The picture was crystal clear, and the audio was incredibly sharp. I cleaned up every speck of dust, leaving the house completely undisturbed. I locked the door and walked away, a ghost haunting my own home. I climbed back into my pickup truck and drove exactly 4 miles down the interstate to a nondescript budget hotel tucked behind a strip mall. I paid for the room in cash for the entire week, ensuring there would be no electronic trail linking me to the area. The young clerk barely looked up from his phone as he handed me the magnetic plastic keycard. I walked down the dimly lit carpeted hallway, finding my room on the 2nd floor. It was small, smelling faintly of harsh cleaning chemicals and stale air, but it was completely secure. I stepped inside, let the heavy door swing shut behind me, and engaged both the deadbolt and the metal security latch. I dropped my duffel bag onto the stiff mattress, walked over to the small laminate desk sitting beneath the window, and pulled out my laptop. I plugged the power cord into the wall outlet, flipped the screen open, and connected to the secure network I had just established. My heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm as I typed in the encrypted access code. The screen blinked black for a fraction of a second before dividing into 3 crystal-clear video feeds. I was looking directly into the heart of my own home. The living room was perfectly still, bathed in the soft afternoon light, streaming through the large bay windows. The kitchen was equally quiet, the marble island polished and bare. My own in-law suite remained completely undisturbed, just the way I had left it. For a long while, I just sat there in the sterile hotel room, staring at the glowing screen. It was a strange, deeply unsettling feeling to watch the silent rooms of the house I had purchased with my own blood and sweat. It felt like I was spying on a museum exhibit of my former life. About an hour later, the front door on the living room feed swung open. Brad and Tiffany walked in carrying brown paper grocery bags. Tiffany looked entirely relaxed, laughing at something Brad had just said. Brad smiled back, looking lighter and more at ease than I had seen him in months. They looked like a perfectly happy, normal family, returning from a mundane weekend chore. There was absolutely no lingering guilt on their faces. There was no hesitation or shame about the fact that they had just attempted to legally strip me of my freedom and my fortune. They set the bags down on the marble kitchen island. Tiffany immediately reached for her designer phone and started dialing a number, her face twisting back into that familiar expression of greedy anticipation. I leaned closer to the laptop screen, turning the volume dial up as high as it could possibly go, ready to calmly listen to every single toxic and venomous word she spoke into the quiet room. I took a very deep breath, bracing my old tired heart for the painful truth that was surely about to arrive. As I sat there watching Brad open the refrigerator to put away the milk, completely ignorant of the trap closing around him, a profound wave of heavy grief washed over me. It was not just the pain of his recent actions. It was an older, deeper sorrow rooted in a promise I had ultimately failed to keep. The sterile smell of the budget hotel room suddenly vanished, replaced entirely by the sharp, clinical scent of a hospital ward from 5 years ago. I closed my eyes for a moment and was transported back to that small, quiet room where I sat clutching my wife's frail hand. Martha was losing her long, brutal battle with cancer, her incredible strength finally giving way. Even as her body surrendered, her mind remained remarkably sharp, entirely focused on the family she was about to leave behind. I remember the steady beeping of the heart monitor filling the silence as she pulled me closer. Her skin was pale and incredibly thin, but her eyes burned with an intense, desperate clarity. "Brad is weak, Rick," she had whispered to me, her voice raspy but unwavering. "He has a good heart, but he lacks a strong spine. He wants the easy path. Do not let the cruel world eat our boy alive, but listen to me very carefully. Do not ever let him eat you either." At the time, I had simply kissed her forehead, brushing away her urgent concerns with soothing words. I promised her I would always take care of him no matter what happened. I thought that protecting him meant shielding him from every single financial hardship. I thought being a good father meant writing massive checks to fix his mistakes and buying a massive house to secure his marriage. But staring at the laptop screen now, watching him happily assist the woman who was actively plotting my total destruction, I realized the horrible truth. I had completely failed to heed Martha's profound warning. By blindly giving Brad absolutely everything he ever wanted, I had not actually protected him from the world at all. I had simply fed his innate cowardice. I had nurtured his dangerous sense of entitlement and actively funded Tiffany's insatiable, toxic greed. I had built them a beautiful castle only to let a monster comfortably sit on the throne. I opened my eyes, bringing the live video feed back into sharp focus. The lingering guilt I felt over my failure was quickly replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. Martha was absolutely right. Brad was weak. He was perfectly willing to let me be consumed just so he could maintain his comfortable illusion of a wealthy lifestyle. But I was not going to be eaten alive. Not by him, and certainly not by his ruthless wife. I tightened my jaw, resting my calloused fingers gently on the keyboard. The time for blind generosity was over. I was going to teach my son the lesson I should have taught him decades ago. The quiet humming of the hotel room was broken by the front door opening on my laptop screen. My eyes darted to the live feed. It was not Brad who walked through the door. Tiffany stepped into the foyer, holding the door open for a man who looked completely out of place. It was her older brother, Cody. He was a troubled man, a chronic gambler with a history of substance abuse. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the expensive artwork like a desperate thief. His clothes were rumpled, possessing a dangerous energy that radiated through the screen. Tiffany closed the door and locked the deadbolt securely. She looked triumphant. She motioned for Cody to follow her into the kitchen. I switched my attention to the second hidden camera feed. Tiffany walked straight to the large refrigerator, opened it, and pulled out a bottle of champagne. She grabbed 2 flutes and set them on the island. "Are you sure about this, Sodi?" asked his voice shaking as he leaned against the counter. "Are you sure the old man is out of the way?" Tiffany laughed, a cruel sound that made my stomach churn. She popped the cork on the champagne bottle, the crack echoing loudly. She poured the bubbling liquid and pushed a glass toward her brother. Relax, Cody, she said confidently, taking a greedy sip. He is on his way to Florida to go fishing. He is going to be gone for an entire week. By the time he gets back, his bags will be packed and the locks on that suite will be changed. Cody took a long drink, his hands trembling visibly. Those guys are not messing around anymore, he muttered darkly. They told me I have 5 days to come up with $75,000, or they break my legs. They know where I sleep. Tiffany rolled her eyes. I told you I have it handled, she snapped. You get your money to pay off those loan sharks, and you get a comfortable roof over your head. I leaned closer to the bright screen, my blood running cold, as she outlined the depth of her sinister plot. Here is exactly how this plays out, she explained, tapping her fingernails rhythmically against the cold marble countertop. Tomorrow morning I am officially serving him with a formal 30-day eviction notice. Once we have the legal eviction on paper, Brad is going right back to the bank. We already tried the medical route once, but the branch manager blocked the transfer because the signature looked weird. So we are changing the strategy. I found a corrupt doctor online who is perfectly willing to sign off on an emergency psychiatric evaluation. We are going to falsely claim the old man became violent and disoriented, giving us immediate temporary medical guardianship. Cody stared at her intently, his eyes growing wide. And that gets us the money, he asked desperately. Yes, she smiled wickedly. It gets us full control of his entire retirement account. We take out enough cash to pay off your gambling debts, clear my credit cards, and stick him in that cheap state-run nursing home. Once he is locked up in that horrible facility, you can move your things right into his attached suite. It has its own kitchen and bathroom. You will comfortably live here with us, rent-free forever. Just as she finished laying out this horrifying roadmap, the door leading from the garage clicked open. Brad walked in wearing his work clothes. He stopped dead when he saw Cody standing there holding a glass of champagne. What is he doing here? Brad asked, his voice tight with anxiety. You know we explicitly agreed he was never supposed to come to the house. Tiffany immediately crossed the kitchen and wrapped her arms around my son tightly. He is here because we are celebrating, she purred softly. We finally have a foolproof plan. Brad looked at the two of them, his posture incredibly stiff. I do not know about this, Tiffany, he muttered softly, looking down at the hardwood floor. Faking a psychiatric hold. Taking absolutely all his money. It truly feels like we are crossing a massive line. What if the police get involved? What if he aggressively fights back? He is not a stupid man. He built a massive business. Tiffany pulled away, her expression instantly hardening into cold stone. Do not go weak on me now, Brad, she hissed fiercely. We are drowning financially. If we do not get that money, we lose the house, I lose my car, and my brother gets killed by loan sharks. Do you really want your only son growing up on the streets? Do you want to be a complete failure? Brad flinched, as if she had struck him. The kitchen was completely silent for a long, agonizing moment. I sat in my lonely hotel room silently begging my son through the cold laptop screen to do the right thing. I prayed he would find courage, stand up to this vicious woman, and protect the father who had given him everything. But as I watched, Brad slowly reached out and picked up the champagne bottle. He poured himself a glass, his shoulders slumping in absolute defeat. Just tell me where I need to sign, he whispered, taking a long drink. We do it your way. We get him out of the house. Tiffany smiled a dark, victorious grin that chilled my soul. She clinked her crystal glass directly against his. To our amazing new life, she cheered quietly. I slowly closed the laptop screen with a soft click, instantly plunging the quiet room into darkness. The crushing weight of what I had just witnessed pressed deeply on my chest. There was no lingering hope for any peaceful reconciliation. My own flesh and blood had just sold me out to save a degenerate gambler. But they were playing a dangerous game without knowing the fundamental rules. I sat in the dim light of the budget hotel room for a long time after the laptop screen went dark. The silence in the small space was absolute heavy with the weight of finality. Up until that very moment, a foolish part of my heart had still been holding out hope. I wanted to believe Brad was just confused, caught in the grip of a manipulative woman and desperately needing his father to rescue him. But witnessing him willingly raise that glass of champagne to toast my institutionalization severed that last fragile thread of parental delusion. There would be no more tears. My eyes were completely dry. The profound grief that had weighed down my chest evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hardened void. I was no longer a disappointed father, trying to gently correct a wayward son. I was a seasoned businessman who had just uncovered a coordinated conspiracy to defraud me. I stood up from the flimsy desk chair, walked to the small sink, and splashed cold water onto my face. The man looking back at me in the spotted mirror did not look frail. He looked exactly like the man who had ruthlessly built a commercial empire from scratch. It was time to stop playing defense. I walked back to the bed and picked up my cell phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a specific number I had not called in 3 years. Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was not the kind of lawyer you called to handle a friendly neighborhood dispute. He was a corporate real estate attorney, a legal shark who swam exclusively in the deep waters of high-stakes property litigation. We had worked together closely for over 2 decades. Whenever a massive development project went south, Jonathan was the man I unleashed. He was meticulous, completely devoid of sentimentality, and absolutely devastating in a courtroom. When I originally told him about my plan to hand over $500,000 to secure a luxury home for Brad and Tiffany, Jonathan had practically thrown his expensive pen across his mahogany desk. He warned me repeatedly that mixing family emotion with high-value real estate was a catastrophic recipe for disaster. But instead of letting me walk blindly into the fire, he insisted on building an impenetrable legal fortress around my money. He meticulously drafted a series of complex documents that Brad and Tiffany signed without ever truly reading the devastating leverage those pages contained. I pressed the call button. It rang only twice before a sharp voice answered. Richard, Jonathan said, sounding genuinely surprised. "It has been a very long time. I thought you were entirely busy enjoying your peaceful retirement in that fancy suite." I took a deep breath, the cold resolve settling firmly into my chest. "The retirement is officially over, Jonathan," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of emotion. "I need you to go into your secure archives and pull out the master file from 3 years ago, the property purchase." Jonathan was silent for a brief moment. "Has something actually happened?" he asked cautiously, sensing the heavy tone in my voice. I looked out the small hotel window at the dark parking lot. "They just tried to forge my signature to execute a medical power of attorney," I explained simply. "They are planning to fabricate a psychiatric emergency tomorrow morning, have me declared legally incompetent, lock me in a state facility, and drain my entire $800,000 retirement account to pay off a violent loan shark." The silence on the phone was absolute. Even Jonathan seemed momentarily stunned by the sheer cruelty of the plan. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its friendly warmth, replaced instantly by the icy tone of a predator sensing blood in the water. "I warned you about that woman 3 years ago, Richard," he murmured quietly. "Yes, you did," I agreed, feeling a dark smile cross my face. "And thankfully, I let you draw up the paperwork exactly the way you wanted to. I need you to review every single clause, Jonathan. Every penalty, every condition of default. They are serving me with a formal 30-day eviction notice tomorrow morning. When they hand me that piece of paper, they are officially violating the owner occupancy and good faith agreements of the private mortgage. It is time to pull the plug on this entire operation. I want you to prepare the ultimate counterstrike." Jonathan let out a low, satisfied breath. "I will have the acceleration clause drafted and ready for your signature by tomorrow afternoon," he promised smoothly. "They have absolutely no idea what they just triggered." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed. I immediately began packing my things. I threw my laptop, the cables, and my clothes back into the canvas duffel bag. The fake Florida fishing trip was officially canceled. I had originally planned to stay hidden in this hotel for an entire week, quietly gathering evidence from the shadows while they comfortably dug their own graves. But knowing that the eviction notice was coming tomorrow changed the timeline entirely. I needed to be there. I needed to look them directly in the eyes when they handed me the weapon of their own destruction. I zipped the heavy bag shut and carried it out to my truck, leaving the hotel keycard on the front desk without saying a word. As I drove back toward the upscale neighborhood under the cover of quiet darkness, my mind was entirely clear. I was going to sleep in my own bed tonight. And tomorrow morning, when Tiffany arrogantly tried to kick me out onto the street, I was going to walk right into her trap, take the bait, and quietly prepare to pull the ground right out from under her feet. The morning sun was just beginning to burn off the lingering fog when I pulled my heavy pickup truck back into the driveway. The house was quiet, giving off the false impression of a peaceful suburban sanctuary. I turned off the engine and sat in the cab for a moment, listening to the familiar ticking of the cooling motor. I took one last deep breath to steady my nerves. I stepped out, my heavy boots crunching loudly against the paved concrete, and walked straight to the front door. I did not bother using my key. I simply turned the brass handle and pushed the heavy oak door wide open. The sudden noise echoed sharply through the grand foyer. Tiffany was standing near the sweeping staircase, dressed in expensive workout clothes, holding a green smoothie. When she saw me standing there, her face contorted from mild surprise into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. Her eyes widened, and the plastic cup in her hand crunched under her tightening grip. "What on earth are you doing here?" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings. "You are supposed to be in Florida on a fishing trip." I closed the front door behind me with a solid, resonant thud. The weather down south took a sudden turn for the worse. I lied, smoothly keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. I decided to come back early. My own bed is much more comfortable anyway. I took a step toward the hallway leading to my suite, but Tiffany suddenly lunged forward, physically blocking my path. Her chest was heaving with furious indignation. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into her palms. "No," she snapped, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, chaotic energy. "You do not get to just walk back in here like you own the place. You do not belong here anymore, Richard. You ruined everything by coming back today, but I am not going to let you ruin my life." Before I could even respond to her unhinged outburst, she turned and sprinted toward the kitchen island. She grabbed a thick manila folder, yanked out a single sheet of crisp white paper, and marched aggressively right back to where I stood in the foyer. With a dramatic, violent motion, she slapped the document directly against my chest. The stiff paper fluttered down and landed by my boots. "Pick it up," she demanded, pointing a trembling finger at the floor. I looked down at the document, already knowing exactly what words were printed across the top. It was the formal 30-day notice to quit. The official legal eviction document she had bragged to her brother about just the night before on the hidden camera. I did not move a single muscle to retrieve it. I simply kept my eyes locked onto hers. "You are officially a trespasser in my home now," Tiffany hissed, stepping even closer so I could smell the bitter coffee on her breath. "I have consulted with the authorities. Since you do not have a formal lease agreement, you have absolutely no tenant rights here. You are just an unwanted squatter. You have 30 days to get all your junk out of that suite, but I want you out of my sight right now. If you do not turn around, pack a bag, and leave this property immediately, I swear I will call the police and have you physically dragged out of here in handcuffs." Her voice was dripping with venomous satisfaction. She truly believed she had just delivered the ultimate checkmate. She thought she was ruthlessly discarding a helpless, irrelevant old man. Just as the tense silence settled over the room, the heavy door leading from the attached garage slowly opened. Brad walked into the foyer holding his leather briefcase. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me standing there with the formal eviction paper lying discarded on the polished hardwood floor between my boots. He looked completely horrified, totally caught off guard by my sudden return. He quickly glanced from the document up to his wife, then finally allowed his gaze to meet mine. I did not yell. I did not try to passionately argue my case or desperately beg for any mercy. I simply looked deep into the eyes of the boy I had raised with everything I had. "Is this exactly what you really want, son?" I asked him. My voice was incredibly quiet, but it carried an undeniable crushing weight that seemed to suck all the air right out of the room. Brad swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. He opened his mouth as if he desperately wanted to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but no sound came out. Instead, he just slowly looked away, firmly fixing his eyes on the floorboard, completely unable to face the profound shame of his own cowardice. His total silence was the absolute final answer I needed. I gave him one last slow nod of quiet understanding. I turned my back on both of them and walked calmly down the long hallway toward my suite. I pulled a single sturdy suitcase from the closet. I did not pack the expensive clothes, the heavy tools in the garage, or the cherished photo albums. I left all those precious memories behind, choosing to take only what I needed to survive the coming storm. I zipped the small suitcase shut, grasped the handle tightly, and walked straight back out through the large front foyer. Brad was still silently staring down at the wooden floor. Tiffany, however, had her arms crossed proudly over her chest. As I opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, she let out a loud, triumphant laugh that echoed sharply behind me. She actually believed she had won the entire war. She had absolutely no idea that she had just signed her own devastating financial death warrant. She forgot that I am the actual bank. I grabbed the handle and tossed my single suitcase into the passenger seat of my old pickup truck, and immediately drove away, taking one final lingering look at the sprawling estate. It all looked so incredibly perfect on the immaculate outside, but I intimately knew the dark, rotting truth hidden deep inside. I slowly merged onto the busy interstate, pointing my heavy truck directly toward the towering glass skyline of downtown Charlotte. The unusually slow commuter traffic gave me ample time to let the harsh, cold reality fully settle. My own flesh and blood son had literally stood there and watched me get thrown out like a worthless street dog, doing absolutely nothing to physically stop it. He had permanently bound himself to a cruel woman who viewed me merely as an entirely expendable financial resource. I skillfully navigated the crowded city streets and finally pulled into the secure underground parking garage of a sleek corporate high-rise. I rode the polished steel elevator silently up to the impressive 34th floor. I walked purposefully into the quiet, pristine reception area. A young professional woman politely smiled. I quietly told her my full name, and within mere seconds, the heavy inner wooden doors gracefully opened. Jonathan Pierce confidently stepped out. He wore an immaculate tailored dark suit, his stern expression completely unreadable. He firmly shook my calloused hand and silently led me straight down the hall into his expansive corner office. Jonathan gestured for me to sit opposite his mahogany desk. Sitting exactly in the center, waiting quietly like a loaded weapon, was a thick stack of legal documents bound inside a dark blue folder. I took my seat. Jonathan did not waste time with pleasantries. He immediately opened the folder and spread the pages out methodically. 3 years ago, Richard Jonathan began, his voice incredibly calm and precise. You came into this room with a very generous, foolish plan. You wanted to hand your son $500,000 in cash so he could recklessly buy a sprawling house beyond his financial means. You deeply wanted to call it a simple gift. You genuinely wanted to just wire the massive sum and blindly trust in family loyalty. I nodded my head slowly, vividly remembering how incredibly naive I had been back then. And you flatly refused to let me do it. I replied, my voice steady. I did, Jonathan confirmed with a tight, immensely satisfied smile spreading across his face. Because I have spent 30 years watching greedy children systematically destroy their elderly parents over residential real estate. I adamantly insisted that we aggressively protect your capital, So instead of simply gifting them the money free and clear, we formally structured the entire transaction as a strict private lending agreement. He confidently tapped his heavy gold pen against the very top document. This specific paper right here is the legally binding promissory note voluntarily signed and properly dated by both Brad and Tiffany. It explicitly and undeniably outlines their solemn legal promise to repay the entire $500,000. And right beneath it, he smoothly slid a second, much thicker document forward, is the officially registered deed of trust. This incredibly important piece of paper legally secures that specific promissory note directly against the physical property itself. I leaned forward, looking closely at the blue ink signatures resting at the bottom of the pages. Brad and Tiffany had been so entirely blinded by their desperate, greedy desire to immediately secure that massive luxury home they had hastily signed exactly where Jonathan had placed the little yellow sticky notes, without ever bothering to actually read or understand the massive legal implications. They honestly thought it was just standard bureaucratic paperwork to peacefully satisfy a stubborn old man's overly cautious lawyer. They genuinely thought I was just a silent, powerless sponsor. But the absolute legal truth was entirely different. I am the actual lien holder. I stated quietly, the immense crushing power of that specific reality finally sinking in. Exactly, Jonathan said, leaning far back into his chair and crossing his arms triumphantly. You are not a temporary guest. You are definitely not a tenant. In the strict eyes of the law, Richard, you are the actual bank. You firmly hold the absolute primary mortgage on that entire property. If they dare to default on any of the incredibly strict conditions we carefully buried inside this airtight contract, you have the full legal right to immediately foreclose and take the house back. But Jonathan was not quite finished yet. He reached deep into the blue folder and quickly pulled out one final, slightly thinner document. There is one more beautiful layer to this impenetrable fortress we built. He murmured, his dark eyes gleaming brightly with a predatory legal cunning. When we originally purchased the property, I discovered an interesting, highly profitable quirk in the original municipal subdivision zoning. The sprawling main house sits on one specific, clearly defined parcel of land, but the incredibly long, gracefully winding paved driveway that physically connects their attached garage to the main public road was originally zoned as a completely separate, narrow parcel of land. I distinctly remembered signing a massive mountain of separate, confusing paperwork for that specific strip of black asphalt. I had Jonathan quietly place the official deed to that specific driveway directly into a private limited liability company that I solely and exclusively control. That is absolutely correct, Jonathan nodded firmly. Your private LLC completely owns the access easement. They might legally own the big house, but you entirely own the only physical way to actually access it. Without your explicit written permission, they cannot legally drive a single vehicle onto that property without committing criminal trespass. You have them completely surrounded, Richard. They just arrogantly handed you an eviction notice, falsely thinking they were finally throwing you out into the cold street. What they actually did was blindly hand you the golden key to their very own absolute financial destruction. I sat in the chair, letting the magnitude of Jonathan's words echo through the office. The driveway. I owned the physical asphalt connecting their expensive mansion to the civilized world. Without my permission, they were living on an isolated island of their own making. A slow, satisfied breath escaped my lungs. But Jonathan was not finished dismantling their world just yet. He slid the official eviction document, the very piece of paper Tiffany had arrogantly slapped against my chest, earlier, to the center of his desk. He smoothed out the wrinkles, treating the offensive document as if it were valuable forensic evidence. This arrogant little piece of paper right here, Jonathan said, tapping it with his pen, is the final nail in their expensive coffin. When we drafted the deed of trust 3 years ago, I intentionally included a specific, highly restrictive provision known as the owner occupancy and good faith clause. I looked at the complicated legal jargon packed onto the original mortgage documents, waiting for the translation. It basically means, Jonathan continued, locking his dark eyes onto mine, that your financial contribution was strictly contingent upon you maintaining a permanent peaceful residence on that property until the day you die or voluntarily choose to leave. They legally bound themselves to act in absolute good faith as your hosts and debtors, by formally presenting you with a 30-day notice to quit, by attempting to legally evict you from the premises against your will. They have committed a catastrophic breach of the core mortgage contract. I leaned forward, the exhaustion replaced by a sharp, focused energy. What exactly does that material breach mean for them? I asked softly. Jonathan smiled, a cold, calculating expression. It triggers the most dangerous weapon in real estate law, he replied smoothly. The acceleration clause. In a standard mortgage, if a borrower misses a few payments, the bank might charge late fees or offer a grace period. But because they committed a hostile breach of the primary residency condition, the acceleration clause dictates that the entire remaining balance of the private loan becomes due and payable immediately. You do not have to wait 30 years for them to slowly pay you back. They now owe you the full $500,000 all at once. My mind raced back to the reconstructed credit card statements sitting securely in my canvas tool bag. They do not have $500,000, I stated firmly. Tiffany is completely drowning in secret high-interest debt from designer bags and luxury vacations. She even leased a brand-new luxury vehicle. They do not have $5,000 in liquid cash, let alone $500,000. Exactly, Jonathan said, his voice dropping into a low, deadly register. In a normal situation, a desperate homeowner might try to run to a traditional bank to quickly refinance the house and pay off the private lender. But traditional banks require a pristine credit score and an excellent debt-to-income ratio to underwrite a jumbo loan. If what you are telling me about her hidden spending habits is true, no reputable financial institution will ever approve them for a mortgage. They are completely and utterly trapped. What is the exact timeline here? I asked, feeling the heavy gears of justice finally locking into place. I am drafting the official notice of foreclosure right now, Jonathan stated, turning his attention to his sleek monitor. Under state law, given the hostile nature of this deliberate contract breach, we are legally demanding the full accelerated payment within exactly 7 calendar days. If they fail to deliver a certified bank draft for $500,000 by the end of business on the 7th day, we immediately file the foreclosure deed with the county clerk. We seize the entire property, void their equity, and legally evict them from the premises. He began typing rapidly, the sharp clicking of his keyboard filling the quiet office with a rhythmic finality. I watched him work, feeling a strange sense of profound detachment. This was my son. This was the boy I had taught to throw a baseball in our old backyard. The boy I had protected from every harsh reality of the world. Yet as I sat there preparing to legally strip him of his home, I felt absolutely no guilt. He had made his choice the moment he stood silently in the foyer and watched his cruel wife hand me the eviction papers. He had made his choice the moment he raised a glass of champagne to celebrate my planned institutionalization. He wanted to play a ruthless game of financial survival, but he had foolishly challenged the man who actually wrote the rulebook. After 20 minutes of precise work, Jonathan hit a button, and the heavy commercial printer in the corner hummed to life. He gathered the freshly printed pages, stapled the corners, and placed the thick document in front of me. He handed me his heavy gold pen. This is the official notice of foreclosure. Richard, he said quietly. It formally outlines the breach of contract, cites the acceleration clause, and demands the full $500,000 in 7 days. Once you sign this, there is no turning back. It is a legal declaration of total financial war. I did not hesitate. I took the heavy pen and pressed the ballpoint against the white paper. I signed my name with the smooth, deliberate strokes of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. I pushed the signed documents back across the polished mahogany desk. Jonathan inspected the signature, nodded in satisfaction, and slid the papers into a red folder. "How do we deliver this to them?" I asked, my voice as cold as winter ice. "I want them to fully understand the massive mistake they just made." Jonathan closed the folder and looked up at me. "We do not just mail something like this, Richard. We make sure it is delivered with the maximum possible impact." I left Jonathan's office with the heavy red folder safely tucked under my arm, feeling a strange, profound sense of liberation. For the first time in 3 long years, I was no longer an unwanted guest, quietly tiptoeing around my own property. I was the landlord, the bank, and the absolute architect of their impending reality check. I drove my old pickup truck across town to a high-end luxury short-term rental building overlooking the city skyline. I had spent the previous night in a cheap, depressing budget hotel, trying to preserve my savings while I gathered evidence, but I was done living like a frightened fugitive. I walked up to the penthouse suite I had just booked, swiped the key card, and stepped into a sprawling, immaculate space filled with modern leather furniture and floor-to-ceiling glass windows. I poured myself a single glass of aged bourbon from the complimentary bar, sat down on the plush sofa, and opened my laptop. It was time to check the live feeds one last time before the hammer fell. The cameras instantly connected, projecting the interior of my former home onto the bright screen. The atmosphere inside the house was electric, with a sickening, victorious energy. Tiffany was practically floating around the large marble kitchen. She had her designer phone pressed tightly to her ear, frantically pacing back and forth as she organized what sounded like an incredibly lavish event. I turned the volume all the way up. She was speaking to a high-end local catering company, aggressively demanding premium cuts of Wagyu beef, imported oysters, and multiple cases of expensive vintage champagne. "We are hosting a massive backyard barbecue this coming Saturday," she loudly boasted to the caterer on the phone. "We are celebrating. We finally reclaimed our entire house and got rid of the dead weight. I want everything to be absolutely perfect, so all my friends can see the new space. We are completely redesigning the guest wing." I watched her eagerly swipe her maxed-out credit cards to pay the exorbitant deposit, pushing her secret mountain of debt even higher, just to impress people who did not truly care about her. In the background, Brad was sitting quietly at the kitchen island, staring blankly at a sports channel on the television. He looked exhausted, visibly carrying the heavy, cowardly guilt of betraying his own father. But he said nothing to stop her reckless spending. He just let her continue building their fragile house of cards. And then, as if the scene was not already toxic enough, Cody walked into the kitchen. Her deadbeat brother had already brought his dirty duffel bags into the house. He opened the refrigerator, grabbed a beer, and loudly asked Tiffany which bedroom in my newly vacated suite he should claim as his own. She laughed warmly and told him to take the master. Watching them actively carve up my life and celebrate my forced exile filled me with a deep, unsettling calm. It was the heavy, breathless silence that always immediately precedes a devastating hurricane. They thought they had successfully navigated the storm, completely unaware that the darkest clouds were just beginning to gather. I took a slow sip of the smooth bourbon, letting the warmth settle deep into my chest. Tiffany wanted a massive audience to show off her newly stolen kingdom. She wanted to parade her artificial wealth in front of all her superficial friends. I decided right then and there to give her exactly what she wanted. I would provide the grand finale for her expensive little performance. I closed the laptop screen, ending the live feed of their arrogant celebration. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct non-emergency line for the local county sheriff's department. A calm, professional voice answered the call after the second ring. I introduced myself clearly and asked to be transferred directly to the civil division desk. When the duty officer picked up, I explained my exact situation in careful, measured tones. I informed him that I was a private lender holding a registered deed of trust, and that I needed to officially serve a highly volatile notice of foreclosure and an immediate acceleration demand to a hostile borrower who had recently threatened me with police action. I requested a formal civil standby, an official police presence to guarantee my physical safety, and ensure the legal documents were served without any violent escalation. The duty officer listened intently to the specific details. When I mentioned Cody's presence in the house and his known connections to violent loan sharks, the officer immediately agreed that sending a uniformed deputy was absolutely necessary. We coordinated the exact timing down to the minute. I did not want to show up early in the morning when the house was quiet and empty. I explicitly asked the sheriff's department to meet me at the end of my private asphalt driveway precisely at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday. Right in the very middle of Tiffany's extravagant backyard barbecue, right when the expensive champagne was flowing and her superficial friends were completely captivated by her lies. The officer confirmed the appointment, promising that a patrol cruiser would be waiting for my signal. I thanked him sincerely and hung up the phone. I leaned back into the soft leather couch and looked out the massive glass windows at the sprawling city below. The trap was set. The legal documents were signed and secured in my red folder. The police were officially scheduled to arrive. All I had to do now was comfortably wait out the next 48 hours. Tiffany thought she had brilliantly orchestrated my tragic downfall, but she had merely built the perfect crowded stage for her own absolute public humiliation. And I was going to make sure she remembered this specific weekend for the absolute rest of her miserable life. I closed my eyes and finally let myself properly rest. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze, exactly the kind of weather you would order for an outdoor event. I sat in the driver's seat of my pickup truck, parked discreetly down the street from the massive iron gates of the property. The time on my dashboard read 1:45 in the afternoon. Even from a block away, I could hear the heavy bass of the club music thumping from the expensive sound system I had personally installed. I rolled down my window, letting the scent of mesquite smoke and searing meat drift into the cab. Tiffany had spared no expense for her victory celebration. Through the gaps in the tall hedges, I could see the sprawling backyard completely transformed. There were easily 50 guests mingling on the pristine green lawn. Women in designer sundresses and men in crisp linen shirts stood around high-top tables draped in white silk. Professional servers in black vests carried silver trays loaded with imported oysters and delicate appetizers. The catering staff was busy searing thick cuts of Wagyu beef on the massive outdoor grill. It was a perfect display of incredible wealth, entirely built on a foundation of cruel lies and stolen money. I checked my phone. 1:50. I watched the live feed from the camera hidden in the kitchen. Tiffany was holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne surrounded by a tight circle of gossiping friends. She looked radiant, completely intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. I turned the volume up just enough to hear her over the thumping music. "It is so incredibly liberating," Tiffany was saying. Her voice projected loudly enough to ensure everyone nearby could hear her tale of survival. "For 3 long years, we have been held hostage in our own home. My father-in-law just refused to leave. He was a freeloader taking advantage of Brad's good nature. He contributed nothing to the household and expected me to wait on him hand and foot. But I finally put my foot down. I told him this was my house, my rules, and he needed to pack his bags. You should have seen his face when I handed him the eviction notice. I practically had to throw him out onto the street myself." Her friends gasped in exaggerated sympathy, raising their glasses to toast her bravery. "Oh, Tiffany, you are so strong for dealing with that toxic situation," one of the women cooed. Just beyond her circle of admirers, I saw Brad. He was standing near the outdoor bar, gripping a bottle of beer, tightly looking incredibly pale. He knew the absolute truth, but he simply smiled and nodded whenever someone congratulated him on reclaiming his space. Cody was hovering nearby, eagerly stuffing his face with expensive seafood, completely at home in the lavish lifestyle he had zero hand in earning. They were all celebrating my supposed demise, completely ignorant of the dark storm clouds about to decimate their perfect afternoon. I glanced at the dashboard clock one last time. It was precisely 1:58. I put the truck in gear and slowly pulled away from the curb, driving straight toward the private entrance of the estate. The time for quietly watching from the shadows was over. I parked my truck at the edge of the long asphalt driveway, intentionally blocking the path of any luxury vehicles that might try to leave. A marked county sheriff cruiser pulled up silently behind me, the heavy tires crunching softly against the gravel shoulder. The uniformed deputy stepped out. An imposing man with a stern expression, his hand resting comfortably near his utility belt. I gave him a brief nod, tucked the thick red legal folder under my arm, and began the long walk up the driveway. My heavy work boots struck the paved surface with a steady rhythmic thud. I bypassed the front door completely and headed straight for the arched wooden gate leading to the sprawling backyard. The thumping bass of the music grew louder with every step. I pushed the heavy wooden gate open. It swung wide, hitting the stone wall with a loud crack that briefly cut through the noise of the party. I stepped onto the pristine green grass. For a few seconds, nobody noticed me. The guests were entirely absorbed in their expensive drinks and shallow conversations. I walked slowly through the crowd, parting the sea of designer clothes and bewildered faces. Finally, the catering manager spotted me and frantically signaled the DJ to lower the music. As the heavy bass faded into an awkward, sudden silence, heads began to turn. Tiffany was standing near the edge of the sparkling swimming pool, mid-laugh, holding her champagne glass high. The laugh died instantly in her throat, the absolute second her eyes locked onto mine. The color drained completely from her flushed face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Her manicured hand trembled so violently that champagne spilled over the rim of her crystal glass, splashing onto her expensive shoes. "You!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysterical rage, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the party. "What the hell are you doing here? You are officially trespassing on my property. Get out right now before I call the cops." I stopped walking, standing perfectly still in the very center of her extravagant celebration. I looked at her, then looked at the crowd of silent, staring guests. I let a slow, cold smirk spread across my face. "You do not need to call the cops, Tiffany," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet yard. "I brought them for you." Right on cue, the heavy wooden gate swung open for a second time. The tall, uniformed sheriff stepped firmly into the backyard, his silver badge gleaming brightly in the afternoon sun. He walked purposefully to my side, surveying the shocked crowd with a hardened, professional glare. The absolute silence that suddenly fell over the entire backyard was completely deafening. The tall deputy stopped right beside me, his hand resting casually on his heavy duty belt. You could hear a pin drop on the manicured grass. Every single eye in the yard was locked onto the two of us. Tiffany stood frozen by the edge of the pool, her knuckles completely white around the stem of her champagne glass. She quickly tried to recover her shattered composure, pasting a rigid smile onto her face. "Officer," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "thank goodness you are here. This man is aggressively trespassing on my private property. I formally served him with an eviction notice yesterday. Please remove him immediately." The sheriff did not flinch. He did not step toward me, nor did he reach for his handcuffs. Instead, he looked at the small notepad he had pulled from his breast pocket. "Are you Tiffany Dawson?" he asked, his voice deep and entirely devoid of any warmth. She blinked clearly, taken aback by his completely unresponsive demeanor. "Yes," she stammered, standing a little taller, trying to regain her dominant posture. "I am the absolute owner of this house." The deputy reached out and gently took the thick red folder from under my arm. He walked slowly around the edge of the sparkling pool, his heavy boots echoing on the stone pavers, until he stood directly in front of her. He extended his arm, holding the heavy folder out. "I am here to formally serve you with these legal documents on behalf of the primary lien holder," the deputy stated firmly. "Please take the file." Tiffany stared at the red folder as if it were a live grenade. She slowly reached out her trembling hand and took it. Her eyes darted wildly from the deputy back over to me, searching for some logical explanation. "What exactly is this?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the gentle rippling of the pool water. This was my moment. The exact moment I had sacrificed my own peace to orchestrate. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, commanding the expansive backyard space with absolute authority. I looked her dead in the eye, making sure my voice carried to every single guest standing in the suffocating silence. "You wanted me out of your house, Tiffany," I announced loudly, letting the words ring out like a bell. "You wanted to aggressively kick me to the curb and parade your fake wealth in front of your friends. Fine. I accept your eviction. But you forgot one incredibly important thing. I am the bank." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy onlookers. Whispers erupted instantly, but I held up my hand, and the yard fell completely silent once again. "When I handed you and Brad $500,000 3 years ago, I did not just give you a generous gift," I continued, my tone sharp and unforgiving. "I executed a formal promissory note and a registered deed of trust. I hold the primary mortgage on this entire property. And buried inside that legal contract is a strict owner occupancy and good faith clause. By formally handing me a 30-day notice to quit yesterday morning, you committed a hostile breach of our agreement." Tiffany ripped open the red folder, her eyes frantically scanning the dense legal text printed on the crisp white pages. Her breath hitched in her throat as the devastating reality of the bold legal jargon finally broke through her thick layers of arrogance. "You violated the core mortgage terms," I declared, stepping even closer so she could truly feel the immense weight of my presence. "That breach immediately triggers the acceleration clause of the private loan. You now owe me the full $500,000 in exactly 7 days, or this entire house goes straight to a public foreclosure auction." The champagne flute slipped from her numb fingers and shattered violently against the hard stone patio. The expensive liquid pooled around her designer shoes, completely ignored. "No," she gasped, shaking her head in frantic denial, her perfect facade crumbling. "You cannot do this. We legally own this house. My name is on the official deed." "Your name is on a deed that is entirely chained to my money," I corrected her coldly. "And you just broke the chain. You thought I was just a clueless, dependent old man you could casually manipulate and discard. You thought you could secretly plot to steal my retirement fund to pay off your deadbeat brother's violent loan sharks, and I would just quietly disappear into a state-run nursing home." I watched the faces of her 50 guests physically recoil in absolute horror. The superficial friends she had so desperately tried to impress were now staring at her with profound disgust. I had just laid her darkest secrets completely bare in front of her entire high society circle. I saw Cody quietly slip out the back gate, abandoning her. Brad finally broke through the stunned crowd, his face ashen, looking exactly like a man walking to the gallows. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "We can talk about this inside. We can tear up the eviction notice. We can just go back to the way things were." I turned my gaze to my son, feeling a brief pang of sorrow before the icy resolve completely took over. "There is no going back, Brad," I said firmly. "You made your final choice when you raised a glass of champagne to celebrate my institutionalization. You willingly stood by while your wife tried to rob me blind. I gave you every opportunity to be a good man, and you chose to be a coward." The deputy stepped back, indicating his official duty was complete. "You have exactly 1 week to produce a certified bank draft for $500,000, I stated, turning my back on them. The heavy silence hanging over the backyard was suddenly broken by a sharp, brittle sound. It was Tiffany. She was laughing. It was not a genuine laugh, but a high, desperate cackle that grated against the quiet tension of the afternoon. She turned away from the red folder, plastering that familiar condescending smile back onto her face as she looked around at her stunned guests. "Oh, please, do not look so worried, everyone," she announced, waving her hand dismissively as if swatting away an annoying insect. "This is just a pathetic, desperate prank. My father-in-law has been struggling with his mental health lately. He is just confused. He probably went online and printed out some fake legal forms to scare us. because he is upset about having to move into a proper care facility. She walked over to her closest friend, placing a reassuring hand on the woman's shoulder. I am so sorry you all had to witness this little episode. Tiffany continued raising her voice to ensure the entire yard heard her spin the narrative. Brad and I are the sole owners of this property. We have the actual deed. This piece of paper means absolutely nothing. It is just the sad, desperate acting out of an old man who does not know how to let go. Now please let us get back to the music. The Wagyu is probably getting cold. She aggressively gestured for the nervous catering manager to quickly turn the loud club music back on, but the manager just stood completely frozen, staring at the imposing figure stepping through the wooden gate. I had not come to this party alone. Walking with measured, confident steps right behind the sheriff was Jonathan Pierce. He wore an immaculate charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place at a backyard barbecue, but perfectly suited for a legal execution. He stopped beside me, adjusting his silver tie, his sharp eyes locking onto Tiffany with the cold precision of a predator. I assure you, Mrs. Dawson, this is not a prank, Jonathan said, his voice smooth, resonant, and effortlessly carrying the unquestionable weight of authority. And I strongly suggest you stop lying to your guests before you make your impending bankruptcy even more embarrassing. Tiffany took a step back, her fake smile completely collapsing. Who the hell are you? She demanded, her voice trembling again. Jonathan reached into his tailored jacket and produced a crisp business card, holding it up for the closest guests to see. My name is Jonathan Pierce, he stated clearly. I am a senior partner at Pierce & Vance Real Estate Law. I am the attorney who personally drafted the legal framework for this entire property transaction 3 years ago. The document you are currently holding in your shaking hands is a fully registered deed of trust, officially recorded with the county clerk. It is an ironclad legal instrument. My client, Richard Dawson, holds the primary lien on this estate. You do not own this house free and clear. You simply hold the title subject completely to his private mortgage. Jonathan paused, letting the heavy legal reality sink into the minds of everyone present. And because you foolishly decided to serve your primary lender with a hostile eviction notice. He continued, his tone dripping with professional disdain. You have materially breached the contract. The acceleration clause is now active. This document is a formal notice of foreclosure. If you do not wire $500,000 to my firm by the close of business next Friday, the locks will be changed and you will be physically removed from the premises. Tiffany looked down at the red folder, her chest heaving as she finally realized the inescapable trap she had walked right into. She looked desperately over at Brad, but he was staring at the ground, utterly defeated. I took one final step forward, invading her space, making sure she felt the full crushing weight of her own arrogance. Oh, and Tiffany, I added, my voice dropping to a low conversational tone that somehow felt infinitely more threatening than a shout. There is one more little detail you should probably know before you start packing your bags. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fresh panic, waiting for the final blow. My private limited liability company owns the exact parcel of land that your long asphalt driveway is built upon, I explained slowly, enunciating every single word. I own the asphalt. I own the gate. I own the only physical access point to this property. So starting tomorrow morning, you no longer have my permission to use my land. If you are not completely moved out by next week, I am bringing my heavy excavator down here to rip up the entire paved driveway. Have fun parking your leased Range Rover in the mud. The absolute crushing finality of my spoken words hung heavily in the still air. Her beautiful, expensive illusion was completely shattered forever. The guests who had spent the entire afternoon drinking her champagne and praising her fake lifestyle began to step away from her as if she were carrying a contagious disease. No one wants to be associated with a sinking ship, especially not people whose entire lives are built on appearances. The wealthy women in designer dresses began quietly picking up their expensive purses. The men set their drinks down on the tables and started heading quickly toward the side gate. There were no goodbyes. There were no sympathetic hugs. They were simply leaving in droves, practically running away from the humiliating spectacle of Tiffany's total financial destruction. Tiffany stood completely alone by the edge of the pool, surrounded by discarded plates and half-empty glasses, watching her carefully constructed high society life evaporate before her very eyes. The sheriff tipped his hat slightly in my direction, signaling that the civil standby was effectively concluded. I turned my back on the silent, ruined party and began the long walk down my asphalt driveway, leaving them to finally face the terrible consequences of their own greed. I had barely taken 3 steps toward the safety of my driveway when a loud, agonizing wail tore through the thick silence of the backyard. I paused, the gravel crunching softly beneath my heavy work boots, and slowly turned around. The last few lingering guests were rushing through the side gates, eager to escape the radioactive fallout of the afternoon. Only the core of the disaster remained by the edge of the sparkling swimming pool. Brad had physically collapsed. He dropped straight down onto the hard stone patio, his knees slamming directly into the sharp, scattered shards of Tiffany's shattered champagne glass. He did not seem to feel the physical pain. His hands were desperately clutching the sides of his head, his chest heaving with violent, uncontrollable sobs. The meticulously crafted facade of the successful independent homeowner was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic image of a terrified child, realizing he was about to lose everything. "Dad, please wait." Brad choked out, his voice thick with mucus and raw panic. He crawled forward a few inches, his designer slacks soaking up the spilled wine and muddy water from the pool deck. "You cannot do this to me. You cannot take my home away. I never wanted any of this to happen. It was all her idea." He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at his wife, throwing her completely under the heavy wheels of the consequences. She was the one who drafted the eviction notice. She was the one who found the corrupt doctor to fake the psychiatric evaluation. She manipulated me, Dad. She told me we were going to lose the house if we did not get your money. I was just trying to protect my family. Please, you have to forgive me. I am your son." Tiffany stared at the man kneeling on the ground, her initial shock rapidly boiling over into a feral, unhinged rage. Her face contorted into a mask of pure disgust. The elegant, sophisticated hostess vanished completely, replaced by a cornered, vicious animal. "You spineless, pathetic coward!" she shrieked, her voice scraping against the stone walls of the expensive house. "How dare you blame me for this disaster? You are the one who happily signed the forged power of attorney. You are the one who stood in the kitchen and drank champagne while we planned it all out. You could not even provide a decent life for your own wife and child without begging your daddy for a massive handout. You are not a real man, Brad. You are just a weak, pathetic little boy who let his ancient father ruin our perfect lives." Her venomous words struck him like physical blows, but Brad was too broken to fight back. He just stayed on his knees, weeping loudly into his hands, the beautiful marriage they had so proudly paraded around, completely dissolving into a toxic puddle of mutual hatred right before my eyes. The sheer ugliness of their true nature was fully exposed, stripping away any lingering doubt I might have harbored about my decision. Suddenly, heavy footsteps pounded against the wooden deck. Cody, who had been quietly lurking near the outdoor kitchen, realized that his golden ticket to safety was evaporating. The $75,000 he desperately needed to pay off his violent loan sharks was now securely locked away behind Jonathan Pierce's impenetrable legal wall. Panic and anger flared in his bloodshot eyes. He shoved a heavy patio chair out of his way and lunged toward me, his fists tightly clenched, his posture radiating pure violence. "You smug old bastard," Cody growled, his face turning a dangerous shade of red as he aggressively closed the distance between us. "You think you can just march in here and ruin everything? I will beat the life right out of you before I let you take that money away from my sister." He took one more threatening step, but he never got the chance to raise his hands. The sheriff moved with terrifying, practiced speed. The tall deputy stepped seamlessly between me and the approaching threat, his heavy boots planting firmly onto the stone patio. His right hand dropped instantly to his utility belt, unsnapping the heavy leather holster and gripping the bright yellow handle of his taser. "That is far enough, son," the deputy commanded, his voice rumbling, like distant thunder, carrying an absolute promise of immediate painful violence. "You take one more step toward this man, and I guarantee you will wake up in the back of my patrol cruiser with 50,000 volts running through your system. Back off right now." Cody froze his chest, heaving, as he stared at the uncompromising wall of law enforcement standing in his path. The violent bravado slowly drained out of him completely, replaced by the stark realization that he was entirely outmatched. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, backing away slowly until he bumped into the outdoor bar. He looked at Tiffany, then at Brad, and finally spat on the ground in utter disgust before turning and practically running toward the side gate, entirely abandoning his sister here to face the music alone. The sudden surge of adrenaline faded, leaving the backyard bathed in a cold, hollow silence. Only the gentle hum of the pool filter and Brad's ragged breathing remained. I stood there looking down at the broken man crying on the patio. Seeing him in pain once broke my heart, but the man looking back at him now was completely empty. I felt absolutely zero emotion. There was no pity. There was no anger. There was just the cold calculus of a closed account. I stepped forward, my shadow falling over his kneeling form. Brad slowly looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen. "You made your bed, Brad," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and devastatingly final. "Now pay the mortgage." I did not wait for his response. I just walked away, leaving them in the ruins of their ruined party. The 7 days that followed were a masterclass in absolute desperation. I did not return to the property during that week, choosing instead to remain safely in the comfort of my rented penthouse. Through the hidden cameras I had installed, I watched their entire world rapidly collapse piece by piece. Tiffany spent the first 2 full days aggressively calling every single major bank and local credit union in the greater Charlotte area. I watched her sit at that expensive marble kitchen island, her manicured fingers trembling as she dialed number after number. She tried to charm the loan officers, playing the role of the wealthy, sophisticated homeowner looking for a quick bridge loan. But the cold banking system does not care about your designer clothes or your expensive zip code. They only care about hard numbers. And Tiffany's numbers were a catastrophic disaster. Whenever a bank pulled her credit report, they immediately saw the massive hidden mountain of high-interest debt she had been secretly accumulating for years. The maxed-out credit cards, the exorbitant personal loans, the luxury vehicle lease she was already behind on. They saw a woman completely drowning in reckless financial obligations. Every single application was instantly denied. By the 4th day, her arrogant demeanor had entirely vanished, replaced by a frantic, unhinged panic. Brad was no better. He took an emergency leave of absence from his corporate job, spending his days pacing the living room floor like a trapped animal. He tried calling my phone dozens of times, leaving long, tearful voicemails begging for a second chance, pleading with me to stop the impending legal proceedings. I listened to every single message, but I never once pressed the call back button. The time for talking had passed the exact moment they decided to steal my life savings. Cody, true to his parasitic nature, disappeared completely by the 5th day. Realizing there was no money to be squeezed from his sister, and knowing his dangerous loan sharks were rapidly closing in, he packed his dirty duffel bags in the dead of night and fled the state, leaving Tiffany to face the brutal music entirely alone. When the close of business finally arrived on the 7th day, the deadline passed without a single penny being transferred to Jonathan Pierce's legal trust account. The financial default was absolute and legally binding. True to his word, Jonathan moved with ruthless efficiency. The very next morning, he formally filed the foreclosure deed with the county clerk. The massive property officially reverted entirely back to my name. Their equity was completely wiped out. The beautiful house was mine again. 2 days later, the local county sheriff returned to the estate. This time, he did not come alone. He arrived with 2 additional deputies and a thick stack of official eviction orders. I drove my pickup truck down the long asphalt driveway right behind their marked patrol cruisers. I parked near the detached garage and calmly stepped out into the cool morning air. The imposing deputies did not bother knocking gently. They pounded heavily on the grand front oak door until Brad finally opened it, looking completely exhausted and utterly defeated. The sheriff handed him the final paperwork, instructing him that they had exactly 1 hour to gather whatever personal belongings they could carry and vacate the premises immediately. If they stubbornly refused to leave, they would be physically removed in handcuffs and formally arrested for criminal trespass. Watching the absolute reality of their dire situation finally crush them was a profoundly sobering experience. Tiffany shrieked and cried violently, throwing expensive clothes into random bags, loudly cursing my name, cursing Brad, and cursing the stoic deputies who stood silently watching her embarrassing public meltdown. Brad simply moved like a hollow ghost, quietly packing his young son's colorful toys and a few basic daily necessities. I walked up the stone steps and stood quietly on the expansive front porch, leaning against the sturdy wooden railing. I watched as they began hauling their hastily packed belongings out of the front door. There was no expensive moving company waiting to carefully transport their luxurious furniture. There was no brand new Range Rover parked in the driveway, waiting to sweep them away in comfort. The leasing company had efficiently repossessed the luxury vehicle 2 days prior, after Tiffany missed yet another massive payment. In its place sat a dented compact rental car that Brad had desperately secured at the absolute last minute. It was a stark, humiliating downgrade that perfectly mirrored the sudden collapse of their entire fraudulent lifestyle. Tiffany struggled to shove oversized black trash bags filled with her wrinkled designer dresses into the tiny trunk of the cheap vehicle. Her flawless makeup was completely ruined, her face stained with streaks of dark mascara and bitter tears. She refused to even look in my direction, completely consumed by the devastating shame of her absolute ruin. Brad carried the last few cardboard boxes out his shoulders, slumped beneath the crushing weight of his monumental failure. He gently placed his young son into the back seat, making sure the child was secure. Then he paused by the driver's side door and finally looked up at me standing firmly on the porch of the house he had just lost forever. He looked like a man who finally understood the true cost of his own cowardice. I looked back at my only son, my face completely devoid of any sympathy. No apologies were offered. No harsh words were exchanged. The silence stretching between us was absolute, heavy, and unbroken. It was the profound, uncompromising silence of absolute victory. Brad slowly lowered his head, opened the creaking car door, and climbed into the driver's seat. He started the weak engine and drove slowly down the long asphalt driveway. I stood silently on my wide wooden porch and watched the cheap little rental car slowly turn out onto the busy main public road, disappearing completely and finally from my life forever. The silence that settled over the estate after their car vanished from sight was not the heavy, suffocating kind I had endured for the past 3 years. It was a clean, breathable silence. I walked slowly back up the long asphalt driveway, unlocked the heavy oak front door, and stepped into the sprawling foyer. The house was a complete disaster, littered with discarded packing materials, abandoned pieces of cheap furniture they could not fit into the rental car, and the lingering ghosts of their toxic marriage. But underneath the superficial mess, the foundation was still rock solid. I spent the next 2 weeks doing what I have always done best. I put on my worn canvas work pants, grabbed my heavy tools, and got to work repairing the damage. I patched the drywall where Tiffany had hastily ripped down her expensive artwork. I repainted the scuffed hallways with warm, inviting colors. I hired a professional crew to deep clean every single square inch of the marble floors and the expansive kitchen. When I finally called a top-tier real estate agent to list the property, It looked better than the day I had originally purchased it. The housing market in Charlotte was incredibly hot, and a luxury estate with a private attached in-law suite was a rare commodity. We received multiple aggressive offers within the very first 48 hours. I bypassed the wealthy investors and the corporate buyers, eventually choosing to sell the home to a genuinely kind young couple who had just relocated from the Midwest. They walked through the bright rooms holding hands, admiring the solid craftsmanship, and excitedly talking about the family they wanted to raise there. They reminded me so much of Martha and myself when we were first starting out. We closed the sale quickly for a final price of $1.5 million. After paying the standard closing costs and broker fees, I walked away with a massive return on my original investment. My bank accounts were completely restored and significantly heavier, but I had absolutely no desire to stay in the city. I packed my pickup truck, leaving the busy urban sprawl far behind in my rearview mirror, and drove straight up into the crisp, cool air of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I spent weeks driving down quiet, winding roads until I finally found exactly what I was looking for. I purchased a beautiful, secluded wooden cabin sitting right on the edge of a pristine mirror-like lake. It was surrounded by towering pine trees and completely isolated from the noise of the modern world. The cabin had a wrap-around porch, a large stone fireplace, and a private wooden dock extending out over the deep water. I bought it completely in cash. For the first time in years, I woke up every single morning to the sound of singing birds instead of slammed doors and bitter arguments. I finally had my peace. But before I could completely sever my ties to the past and settle fully into my new mountain life, there was one final piece of business I needed to firmly lock into place. I drove down to Charlotte one last time. I parked my truck and rode the polished elevator up to the 34th floor to meet with Jonathan Pierce. His office radiated that familiar, calculated legal power. Jonathan greeted me with a genuine smile and warmly shook my hand. I sat down in the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, and we got straight to work. I brought a certified bank draft representing a significant portion of the recent house sale profits. I instructed Jonathan to establish an ironclad, irrevocable trust fund specifically for my young grandson. Even though Brad and Tiffany had destroyed my trust in them, I adamantly refused to let their innocent child suffer the long-term consequences of their profound greed and terrible decisions. Jonathan meticulously drafted the complex trust documents exactly to my rigid specifications. The boy would receive the entire accumulated sum, plus all accrued interest on his 25th birthday. I made absolutely certain that Jonathan inserted the most aggressive legal barriers possible to completely block his parents. Brad and Tiffany were strictly forbidden from ever serving as trustees, financial guardians, or temporary administrators of the account. They could not borrow against it, they could not touch a single dime for educational expenses, and they could not access the money even in the event of a medical emergency. The funds were completely untouchable by anyone except my grandson when he reached adulthood. As I signed the final pages of the heavy trust document securing the boy's future, Jonathan leaned back in his chair and offered an interesting piece of closing news. He informed me that the local authorities had recently raided an illegal underground gambling operation across town. During the raid, they arrested several known loan sharks, along with a desperate man frantically trying to pass forged cashier's checks to cover his massive debts. It was Cody. He was currently sitting in the county jail facing multiple serious felony charges for grand larceny and wire fraud, with no one willing to post his expensive bail. Tiffany's parasitic brother had finally hit the absolute bottom of his downward spiral. I listened to the news with a completely neutral expression, feeling no joy, but certainly no pity. The universe has a remarkably consistent way of balancing its own ledgers. I thanked Jonathan sincerely for his incredible guidance, shook his hand one final time, and walked out of his office. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, stepped out into the bright city sunlight, and climbed back into my truck. The heavy weight I had been carrying for 3 brutal years was completely gone. The books were closed, the accounts were settled, and my final duty as a father was officially over. I turned the ignition, pointed my truck back toward the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains, and drove away. The air up here in the Blue Ridge Mountains is completely different from the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the city. It has been 6 months since I drove my truck up that winding dirt road and officially claimed this beautiful wooden cabin as my own. The crisp morning breeze coming off the lake carries the fresh scent of pine needles and damp earth, a constant soothing reminder that I am finally free. I walked out of the back door of the cabin this morning, holding a steaming mug of black coffee in one hand and my favorite fishing rod in the other. The wooden planks of my private dock creaked softly under my heavy boots as I made my way to the very edge. I set my coffee down on a sturdy wooden post, baited my hook with practiced precision, and cast the line far out into the calm, glassy water. The quiet splash rippled outward, breaking the perfect reflection of the towering green mountains. I sat down on a comfortable wooden folding chair, leaning back and listening to the absolute silence. It is in these quiet moments that the mind naturally wanders back to the brutal storm I survived. I often think about Martha and the deep promises we made to each other. For a long time I carried a heavy, painful burden of guilt, wondering if I had completely failed her by walking away from our only child. But looking out at the peaceful water today, I realized that I did exactly what she asked me to do. I did not let the world eat him alive, but I also refused to let him eat me. I protected the legacy of our hard work. People often romanticize the concept of family. Society tells us that because someone shares your genetic code, you owe them an infinite reservoir of forgiveness, no matter how cruelly they treat you. But my experiences over those long, dark 3 years taught me a very different, much harder truth. Blood makes you related, but respect makes you family. A true family does not view you as a disposable financial asset. They do not plot in the shadows to strip you of your legal autonomy. They do not hand you a 30-day eviction notice and expect you to quietly disappear into the night. I lost a son. That is a profound, irreversible tragedy that will always leave a small, quiet ache in my chest. There will be no more shared holiday dinners, no more casual phone calls to check in, and no more watching my grandson grow up from close range. But in exchange for that painful loss, I kept my dignity. I kept my life. And most importantly, I kept my sanity. I refused to be a pathetic victim in my own story. I took back the power they tried to steal, and I built a fortress of absolute peace right here on this quiet mountain lake. The sun slowly climbed higher above the tree line, warming the chill from the mountain air. I watched the red and white plastic bobber float gently on the gentle ripples of the water. I have not caught a single fish all morning, but that does not bother me in the slightest. Fishing was never really about the catch for me anyway. It has always been about the quiet process, the deep patience, and the solitary reflection. I am entirely content to just sit here breathing in the clean air, knowing that my future is completely secure and entirely my own. There are some people out there who might hear my story and harshly judge my actions. Some say I was too harsh. They might argue that a father should always provide endless grace, that bringing the full weight of the law down on my own son was a cruel and vindictive response. They might think that threatening to tear up the asphalt driveway and physically evict them was crossing a line. I hear those hypothetical criticisms, but I completely disagree. I say I just let them read the contract they signed. I merely enforced the legal boundaries they arrogantly chose to cross. They demanded to play a ruthless game of financial survival, and I simply obliged them by playing my hand to the absolute fullest. But I am genuinely curious about your perspective. What would you have done if you found yourself in my heavy work boots? If you discovered your own flesh and blood secretly plotting to lock you away in a state facility just to steal your life savings? Would you have gracefully forgiven them? Would you have quietly packed your bags and surrendered your hard-earned home? Or would you have fought back with every single weapon at your disposal? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I truly value the community we are building here. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my story today. It is not an easy tale to tell, but it is an important one. If there is one crucial lesson I want you to take away from my experience, it is this. Stay strong and never let anyone tell you that you are just an old man who does not know better. Wisdom does not automatically expire when your hair turns gray. Your years of hard work, your sharp intuition, and your inherent human dignity demand absolute respect. Protect your boundaries fiercely and never apologize for defending your own life. Please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you found any value in my journey. Your support helps me share these important lessons with others who might be silently struggling in similar situations. Stay safe, trust your gut, and always read the fine print. See you in the next one.